Well, welcome to Power Play. I'm Tom Clark. Today from the studios just across the road from Parliament Hill. Well, as I said, the Supreme Court has ruled on the Omar Khadr case, and the ruling was, in a way, a bit of a split decision. The court said that on the one hand, Omar Khadr's constitutional rights had been violated. On the other hand, it did not compel the government to repatriate Omar Khadr. So let's bring in a couple of people now to discuss this, go around the horn. First of all, here in Ottawa joining me, Teneycke, the former Director of Communications for the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, and also in Edmonton, Dennis Edney, who is the Canadian lawyer for Omar Khadr. Thanks very much for being here, both of you. And Dennis, let me start with you. When you read this decision today, what was your take on it? Was it split, or did you see it as a victory?
Well, I don't know about use of the word victory, but what it was a reinforcing the previous Supreme Court decision that Canada had violated Omar Khadr's rights in Guantanamo, and that his rights were continuing to be violated. So that reinforced what we've all known all along. I wish the court would have taken that extra step to order Canada to do something, instead of suggesting and really stating implicitly that Canada has a moral obligation to do something for Omar Khadr, and then the court left the door open to come back before them in the event nothing happens. My experience historically is that I started out naively thinking one could just write letters to the government and they would talk to you. And the only talking I've ever done to the government is when they fight us every step of the way for 6.5 years in every court we've been in.
Well,
so I don't have the same sense of good faith.
Yeah. Well, let me throw this over to Teneycke, because you've raised the issue now of dealing with the government, and during at least part of this time, Corey, you were a central part of this government and so on. Do you feel, knowing the government as you do, that they feel some moral obligation to do something about this now as a result of the ruling, or where do they stand morally on this?
Well, there's a very clear moral obligation here to have Omar Khadr, who's been charged with terrorism and terrorist offenses, to actually face justice in a court. And I think he should, given the serious nature of those crimes, continue to be in jail until he does that. You know, we've seen the other way of approaching this, Tom. The Chrétien government back in '96 made an appeal on behalf of Omar Khadr's father, all the same sob story that we're hearing for Omar, with a slightly different spin on it. And they got him released, and he went off to live in a compound with Osama bin Laden, and as they say, the rest is history. This guy is a little terrorist, and he deserves to stay in jail till he faces a trial. And I think he's probably today one step closer to life in prison in the United States.
But do you think that the government's view then is going to be, as it has been all along, that he should face justice in the United States and not in Canada, notwithstanding what the court says?
Well, you couldn't charge him with anything in Canada because of the laws that were in place the day. So what Omar Khadr's lawyers would like, and some of the bleeding hearts in the law schools, would like to have Omar Khadr come back to Canada and walk free. And in fact, I think they'd take it a step further. They'd like to then sue the Canadian government and try to get him millions. But I think Canadians at home would be, as the government does, very reasonable if you're charged with terrorist offenses that you actually face trial, and if you're convicted that you go into jail and you stay in jail for a very long time.
Dennis, let me get your reaction to this, because I suppose that what Corey's talking about reflects to some degree the thinking of the government here.
Sure, and it shows a lack of ignorance. Corey may not know this, but internationally, Guantanamo Bay has been condemned as a hellhole, as a place where torture takes place and where there's no due process. That's not just my comments. That's comments by members of Congress. That's comments by U.S. military lawyers. That's comments by Lord Goldsmith from the High Court, the House of Lords in Britain. That's internationally known. So that's the first thing. Mr. Khadr is a little terrorist. That is such a simple comment, which doesn't surprise me. What is the difference between Mr. Khadr? His circumstances are very different. The evidence against Mr. Khadr, as Corey should know, is incredibly weak. The vast majority of the evidence is based upon statements taken from torture. And what is the difference
let's
between
let's take a look at some of the video evidence of Omar Khadr. We have videotape of Omar Khadr planting IEDs in Afghanistan. Where's the due process in planting IEDs and blowing up our troops? Where is the due process in al-Qaeda attacks on innocent civilians? There is no due process with al-Qaeda. That's why these terrorists are being detained, and that's why people accused with terrorism go to jail for a very long time.
Dennis, just very quickly, let me ask you this. Is the answer to this debate, though, just to get him in front of some tribunal or some court to decide these issues?
Well, the court before, Corey would know as a tainted process has been condemned. But what I'd like to ask him is, why does our government spend millions of dollars rehabilitating child soldiers who have committed atrocities in places like Sierra Leone and does nothing for Omar Khadr? Why does our government send a private plane to pick up Brenda Martin from Mexico, who was convicted of fraud? And yet with Omar Khadr, it hasn't done one single thing. Omar Khadr is in a places beyond the rule of law. Our government is probably one of the very few governments who's never criticised that place, and they have done absolutely nothing for that young Canadian who's never been given trial for 8 years. That's contrary to our own constitution, who has been abused by our own government, which is contrary to our constitution, and he would just call him a little terrorist when he's not had the opportunity of defending himself in a properly constituted court.
Dennis does bring up an interesting point, Corey. You called him a little terrorist, but he hasn't been tried.
Well, I guess we'll have a court process that will determine whether he's guilty of that. I think there's a pretty huge amount of evidence, and really what you generally hear as counsel, and they're doing it again right now, is not actually deny the nature of the charges against them. They'll say things like the evidence is weak. They'll indicate that he's a child soldier. And that he shouldn't be held responsible. Well, if you were 15 years old and you murdered somebody, you would face trial here, and you'd be, if convicted, sentenced to prison. This is very serious charges. What they're trying to do, Tom, is have this individual brought back to Canada, where they know darn well that he will not face any charges or any judicial process whatsoever. He will walk free and likely then go on to sue the government. So I don't think that Canadians are going to be offended. This sort of line of his rights are abused might win applause at law schools, but not with regular Canadians.
Dennis, last 15 seconds to you.
Well, this is simplistic language. We're not hiding anything. Omar Khadr has spent 8 years without a trial, and you have this man condemn him as a terrorist. The fact is that we do have provisions in our criminal code, terrorist provisions that would allow Omar Khadr to be tried here in Canada. The problem is that the evidence wouldn't stand up in a properly constituted court of law. And I'd ask your Speaker, well, he'd like his children, if they're ever arrested, to be held incommunicado in a jail where he's abused for 8 years without any trial. Is that just some simple left little
Look, he didn't steal a chocolate bar here. This isn't someone who stole a chocolate bar.
I have to jump in. Unfortunately, it's a great conversation. We're out of time. But Dennis Edney in Edmonton, thanks very much for joining us. Corey Teneycke here in Ottawa, thanks very much. Spirited conversation, as they say. Power Play returns.